and today we have the privilege of sitting with Vivian Engel, a family and marriage therapist. We are so happy to have you on the house today and sharing with us your great expertise. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I always like to ask people this, it's like, how did you get, because not only do you deal with families and marriage, you deal specific in a very specific region. And I wanted to know how you got into that. You work a lot with domestic violence.
Right.
So I just wanted to make that clear to all our viewers and listeners. So why
this population, why DV? Quite by accident, actually. I was postgraduate work and I was looking to get my hours towards licensure, and I was working at Jewish Family Service of Los Angeles, which is a big social service agency and had and has lots of different areas, and I was working at a counseling center, and somebody who worked there suggested, hey, there's some openings in our domestic violence program. Would you be interested in working there? There's more opportunity, more hours. And initially I thought, no way, like that's not a population that I had thought about working with. I didn't feel confident. I knew nothing about intimate partner violence or domestic violence, but I wanted my hours, and so I said yes. And almost 14 years later, I am still working at the same agency with the same people, and it has become kind of the passion of my life. I really love it. I have a private practice on the side that I do, but a bulk of my time is spent in the field of intimate partner violence.
And do you find it fulfilling?
I do. I really do. I look forward to going to work. I feel I love all my clients. I have worked with, at this point, hundreds of people. I love facilitating support groups. I really enjoy this work.
I mean, from looking from the outside in, and obviously with my own personal experience, I would think, or one would think, that it can be so heart-wrenching and so sad. So how do you deal with that personally?
Yeah, it is heart-wrenching and it's sad, and I don't have one particular way. It's a combination of experience. When I was a new therapist and just figuring this out, it was really hard. I would take client cases home when there were certain things going on in my personal life, when when I was pregnant and I was working with clients who had newborns or were being abused while pregnant. That was hard. And it's a combination of a good support system, both professionally. I have great colleagues. We have good support with other clinicians. It's my own personal work, and my own personal therapy. It's being physically active. It's having a good community of people outside of work, and just time and experience. Unfortunately, there is a little bit of a desensitization process that happens. The longer you work with this field and trauma, the more separate I can become from it.
I'm sure you've seen everything.
Yeah.
And I'm sure at the same time, when you see something that you haven't seen before, it probably doesn't surprise you.
Yeah. I mean, very little surprises me at this point. And I think I've seen it all, heard it all. But then there's always, a client who kind of comes in with some nuanced way their partner may be abusing them or something that they've experienced, and I'm like, this makes sense in the context of abuse, and I get this.
So over your time, you've been doing this for, I'd say, a long
13,
time.
Yeah, 13, 14 years.
It's a long time. You're not a newbie here.
Right.
Have you seen the methodology or the tactics for an abuser to abuse their victim?
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to use that word, but their selected person. Have you seen a change over that time?
So yes and no. There's definitely been, in terms of change, I would say the use of technology probably has increased. 13 years ago, I wasn't seeing as many clients say that they were being stalked by their partners via, social media or computer, or having them hacking into their systems. So I'm seeing more of that. But it all falls into the same range or into the same category of different control and intimidation tactics, which has been the age-old story around intimate partner violence. So I don't know if I answered that question completely. I mean, yes, and probably using the legal system more and more, just prolonging divorces and co-parenting challenges and the family court system as a way to abuse their partners through that process. I think we've probably I've seen an increase in that.
Yeah, don't we know about that?
Yeah. I don't know if it's a new tactic. It's just something that I'm just seeing more and more of.
So over your career, what has been something that has really, you have found to be the most difficult thing for a person to deal with, the type of abuse that a person has needed to deal with? If there's one, I mean.
Yeah, it's really hard because they're all connected. I think the isolation piece is huge because it cuts you off from so many sources of help and support. I think financial abuse, economic abuse is one of the hardest things as a clinician to work with because there are limited financial resources out in our communities, and we can't minimize how, not having enough resources to either live independently or to hire, legal representation, how that really, keeps somebody stuck in a relationship. So I think, maybe somebody else would say terrible physical violence, but I think it's actually the financial and the isolation that is really painful and keeps people stuck.
Yeah, I experienced both of those things, and I know that it was really a big challenge, and still is, both of those, So what would you recommend to somebody who is feeling that they are isolated? How do you recommend that because it's a challenge. It's a challenge to once you're being isolated, you also want to isolate yourself more because of all the tactics that are being played. So what would you say is one thing that stands out to you that you can do to try and break that cycle?
So the isolation piece, you're right, is really challenging. If somebody can find one person in their life that they can talk to or open up to, sometimes it's easier to speak to a stranger than it is a family member or a friend. And so if nothing else, if you can find resources within your community through the National Crisis Hotline or the DV hotline, that may be enough for now, right? There's so many hurdles, right? Because what you're saying is, I am isolated, and then I isolate myself. When we isolate ourselves, that's largely due to shame, embarrassment, who's going to believe me? And we need support through that. And that's why I say sometimes speaking to a professional or somebody outside of your family or immediate support system can be helpful.
So when someone comes to you, whether it's at Hope or in your personal practice, how do you identify that they really are a victim, or there's somebody just like making up a story or taking something out of context? Or how do you do that? Because I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's probably one of the questions I get asked the most is like, well, how do you know that this person isn't lying and making it up? And to be honest, in the 13 years I've been doing this, I don't believe I've really had a client that I didn't believe was a victim of intimate partner violence. There are clients who are, maybe there's mutual abuse. I've definitely had clients who I believe are the primary aggressor and come in as a victim, but nobody's making it up for their own personal gains. Like, that's a really big misconception. But there's a a consistency around how people who are in abusive relationships or who have been in abusive relationships talk about the experience. They almost all say they feel like they're going crazy. They almost all say, I don't know how to describe what is happening to me or what has happened to me, because if I do, you're going to think I'm crazy or I'm petty or I'm nagging or I'm, making this up. They all have extreme anxiety, right? Low self-esteem. There's a predictability that I hear in all of my clients. They say, my partner is one way with me and a different way with other people. My partner controls my spending or my money, even when we have money and finances are not an issue. My partner is a particular way with my children. But most commonly, it's like there's something happening in my house and I don't know how to explain it. And I feel like I'm crazy a lot of the time.
That's so interesting. I didn't, you don't really think about like how somebody expresses it, and you've seen so many people.
Yeah, and then part of the education process when you're working with a client is showing them, material, sharing books that talk about what is verbal abuse, what is emotional abuse, what is gaslighting, and the specific behaviors. And then they're almost always like, oh my God, yes, that's happened to me. And that's what that's called. Like, yeah, that's, verbal abuse. That's gaslighting. And so it becomes apparent early on that I can usually assess within the first session or two that this is, in fact, a real situation of intimate partner violence.
Wow. So you brought up so much. I have so many questions.
Yeah.
So I want to know, so you said you've seen some people who are the primary abuser and they come in. So if I'm understanding this correctly, is they're the primary abuser, but they're also being abused back? And then they come in as the victim. So how do you deal with that? And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Right. So it can present in a couple ways. One is somebody, I'm going to use this example kind of through the HOPE program, where we get a lot of referrals through, child services or law enforcement or word of mouth. So somebody who maybe is perpetrating abuse will come to us because either they've been misreferred or they see themselves as the victim in this. They don't believe that they're the perpetrator. And very quickly but based on examples, give me examples of what's happening in your life, what brings you here. It is clear how they describe the situation, how they discuss, how they report the other partner. When a victim, and I also don't love that word, but it's always hard. When a victim survivor comes to us, they don't often blame the other partner, their abusive partner. They don't come in saying my abusive partner is crazy, is a terrible person. They in fact come in saying there's something wrong with me. A perpetrator will often come in saying something's wrong with my other partner, right? Like they're crazy. This is they're abusing me and I'm getting in trouble for it, kind of thing. So that's one piece, right? How are they spinning the narrative? Because we know abusers don't take responsibility for their behavior and they will blame other people. And I should say people who abuse. I don't want to say abusers, but and then in some situations there's mutual abuse where both partners perpetrate against each other, and it can be hard to differentiate who's the primary aggressor. And we can't use gender necessarily to categorize that, because women abuse men too. Yeah. And then we are assessing what's the level of fear and control? Do both partners use fear, control, power tactics against the other? So then maybe it's mutual abuse versus one who is a primary and one who is a respondent, right? Somebody who holds the power, holds the control, uses intimidation, and then the other partner who may act out with physical violence or even, verbal abuse, but in response to the other partner's abuse.
That's so.
Does that make sense?
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. So you obviously deal with all of these things differently.
Right.
So I mean, you have such a wonderful way of like looking at this and describing it. And as you said, like sometimes clients get referred to you through child protective services or through law enforcement and things like that. Like, is there training, and you probably don't even know the answer, but is there training on that side for them to be able to spot the victim a little bit better? Or do they come to you guys for training? How does that work?
Well, in theory, yes. So, for example, the Department of Child and Family Services, this is a department, this is an organization that is largely staffed by social workers. And domestic violence is a required training, and they should and likely are getting the training and the information. How much of it gets applied and how much of it do they like really understand? It's, you know, it's a one-time, maybe 40-hour training that they do. I don't know how often they like repeat that. So yes, they get it. Same thing with law enforcement. Our program has done a lot of outreach. We do in the community. We go to clergy, we go to law enforcement, we go to schools if possible, and try to educate the community on what to look for. But again, it's not a perfect system, and things, you know, kind of fall through the cracks. But you know, when we've had law enforcement come kind of speak to us about how they respond to domestic violence cases, you know, they're not mental health professionals. They come in a crisis situation. They have a very limited amount of time to kind of discern what's happening, and they don't always do it well.
Yeah. I mean, everyone does the best that they know how. That's what I hope for.
Right.
So you do a lot of outreach to people in the community,
yes,
which I think is amazing. But I find that, you know, I mean, I don't have the experience that you have. It's a very different perspective. But obviously I have friends who I've met through, you know, going through this process. And I find that some people, they just don't want to believe it. They want to put their head in the sand and not believe it because they don't want to confront the fact that this happens.
Yes.
So how do you deal with that?
I don't know how do I personally deal with that? I mean, it's a big challenge. We are facing lots of kind of taboos, and people don't like to talk about violence and abuse, and we have a very narrow understanding of what relational abuse looks like, and most of the time that's physical violence. And I think most people can wrap their head around that a little bit because it's something they can see or they can imagine. Everything that is below the surface, the verbal, the emotional, the psychological toll, is much harder for people to understand. And I think we're up against a lot of just cultural beliefs around marriage, and we have to keep what happens. And, you know, it is 2023, but I think our understanding of relationships and what happens in homes is still pretty antiquated. And we really believe, or I should say, people believe that this stuff needs to be kept private, and well, there's two sides to every story, and I don't want to think about what's happening in somebody else's home because I have to confront something that's ugly, and I have to look at myself, right? I have to look at my own relationships. I have to look at my own childhood. And so we don't like words like abuse or family violence. It makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah, I know. I experienced a lot of the things that you mentioned, you know, like I was like, oh, you must have done something. I was like, no, this is, you know, you're trying to explain it and people don't want to listen. So what is it like when a client comes to you, whether it's in your personal practice or at Hope? How do you deal with it? And let's start with that.
Yeah. So the beginning stages of therapy is number one, focused on building a rapport with the client. So listen, going to therapy, if you've never been in therapy, and most of the clients that come to Hope don't have a lot of experience with therapy. And again, they think therapy is for crazy people. And here I am, I feel crazy, I'm going to go see a therapist. And by the way, my partner has also told me that I'm crazy and that I probably need to be put on meds, or I need to go to see a shrink or be hospitalized, right? So all these things kind of collide, and you come to therapy and you have to talk about things that you probably haven't said out loud to anybody else with a perfect stranger, right? Therapy is a unique relationship because my client's going to come and tell me about their lives and what's going on, and I'm not going to tell them about my personal life, right? It's one directional in that way. So it's really about building rapport, getting them comfortable with me, or whatever clinician they're seeing, and we spend so much time just educating and calling things what they are. It's really important in this work to call something abuse, right? Not just anger management, or a bad temper, or calls me bad names, right? Like, those are all examples, but to say, well, that sounds like verbal abuse. Let's talk about what verbal abuse really is. That sounds like financial abuse. What is financial abuse? So I spend so much time with the client just working on the education piece and letting them know that, like, there's a name for what you're going through. There are books written about it. There are so many people who are living this and have gone through this and who have made it through on the other side too, because you are so siloed in your life. Like, you think that this is only happening to you. We compare our internal states to other people's external presentations. We look around us and everybody seems to have a happy, normal marriage. Everybody's kids seem to be fine and well-adjusted. What's going on with me? What's wrong with me? What's happening in my family? So it's so validating. And sometimes that just on its own, helping a client see that they're not crazy, that this is something that's happening to them, that they're living in a crazy situation maybe, but that there's nothing wrong with them, that can be a game changer. And then after we spend time doing that, then we talk about, like, what do you want? Like, what are your goals? Do you want to, if you're in a relationship, do you want to leave that relationship? Not everybody wants to leave their relationship. Not everybody can. So if leaving is not an option, what does staying look like? If leaving is an option, what would that look like, and how do we do that safely? If you've already left a relationship and now you're dealing with symptoms of post-traumatic stress, or talking about symptom management and coping skills and helping you understand why you're having flashbacks or why you're having nightmares and it's been 3 years. So much education on trauma and the brain and what happens in your body and how it gets stored. So that's really how therapy often is structured, a lot of support and education.
I know for me personally, the education was so key to my healing. And I love what you said about naming it. I don't know if you know, there's this guy on YouTube. He's called H.G. Tudor. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
He's a proclaimed narcissist, and he lives in the UK, or at least he's British. His identity is secret. And I often listen to him because he will take, like, people in the news and celebrities and things like that and break down so you can start to learn, like, oh, that's this kind of tactic and that's whatever. And he says he is using his narcissism to give him notoriety, and he's okay with doing this, and he helps people to get out of relationships and to see where they've had their downfalls, which I think is pretty awesome. But I was listening to an interview, or not an interview, I was listening to him, it was actually an interview, and he was talking about online dating, which I thought was so fascinating. And the reason I bring this up is because he said he was, like, getting frustrated about the fact that everyone's trying to soften the language of a narcissist. Mm-hmm. He said, like, ghosting is not a narcissist. He said he that is gaslighting. He said, say it what it is. What was the other thing that he said? Zombie behavior. That is also narcissistic behavior. That is not, everyone's just making it acceptable today by using the softening language. So being able to name it, like you're saying, and you're going through this process and giving it these real names of what it is, and they're not nice. They are harsh, and they are, bring up a reality that you didn't imagine for your life.
Yeah.
And so how do you feel that your clients deal with that? Or how do you take your clients through that so it's not as confronting as it really can be?
Well, so remember, there's a lot of rapport building. So hopefully the client is trusting the process and is seeing like, oh, this person really understands what's happening here. And I'm always very honest with my clients that this is going to be uncomfortable. Like, my job here is not to collude with your denial. You're coming to me for my professional experience and my knowledge. And so I'm going to help you. And I always talk about this as a process and a journey. Like, I'm here with you. So we'll do this together. But I also have to, I read cues and pick up cues from the client. Like, how ready are they to hear some of this? And if they're not, I go maybe a little slower, a little softer. If they are more open and willing, I'll have a client who I'll say, you may want to consider reading this book. And they'll be like, okay. And the next time I see them, within a week, I've read that book and I've purchased, all the other ones. And then I think, okay, maybe this client's ready to hear a little bit more, for me to appropriately label the behavior that they've been experiencing. And other clients, who you'll give a recommendation and they're like, yeah, I haven't, not ready yet. Okay, so we'll go a little slower. So it's letting the client lead. I don't want to scare anybody off. I don't want anybody to have a negative experience in therapy. I know how much courage it takes to go seek help, and to seek this specific kind of help at, an agency that does this, right? It takes a lot of guts.
I often think about, like, how do people land up, at you? Because mine was completely by the hand of God. I say that. And I thought I was contacting you guys for something completely different.
Totally different, yeah.
So how... So when you are feeling isolated and you do have so much shame and you are blaming yourself, how does somebody land up with you?
Yeah. So Jewish Family Service has a really great reputation in the community, in the Los Angeles area, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, social service organization in Los Angeles. So some of it, a lot of it is just word of mouth, and we get referred people by other clients and former clients. Some of it is through the outreach that we do in the community, and people know about us. The national domestic violence hotline is a huge referral source. Our program used to be called Family Violence Project. That was the original name of it. It was based on a project that happened, that it was graduate work, and we had been known by that name for years. And we went through a rebranding and we changed to Hope. And I think originally, like, Family Violence Project, that seems so scary, and that's like a big name. And people would definitely come to us with, like, I don't know if I'm being, like, I have violence in my family. That seems so harsh to say that. I think now that we are Hope, maybe people come in with a little bit more, less concern. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah. It is, but I also feel like your organization does give hope.
Yeah.
So I think that's the perfect name for it. So obviously I know you can't mention clients by name, or trying to point them out, but I would love to know, one of you look back over your time there. I wanted to know, who stands out as your biggest success story? Because that's what we're doing here. We want to help people to know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And just if you could describe their circumstance, why you chose that story.
It's hard to think of like one, because And we have, what is a success story, right? Is a success story somebody who leaves an abusive relationship? Maybe not necessarily. Somebody who finds a...
So for me, success is somebody who moves past from being a victim to, you know, thriving in their life. I like to say from surviving to thriving.
Sure.
Whether it's still in their relationship, but they kind of get out of that victim mentality.
Yeah.
Or they unlock themselves from the trauma.
Sure.
If it's not necessarily, you know, domestic violence, it could be some other kind of prolonged trauma that they've been exposed to, but it's really releasing that from them and being able to move forward.
Right.
So yeah.
So there's probably one client that comes to mind because I got to work with her over a very long period of time, which is not always possible. So she originally came to me you know, many years ago when her children were still relatively young. I want to say like middle school, late elementary, middle school. And it was one of your very typical abuse situations. Husband was a well-earning attorney, and she was a stay-at-home mother and primarily was responsible for, you know, the household and the children. Educated, came from a really lovely family, had friends and a support group, had hobbies. But, you know, over the years and the ongoing abuse and her husband was verbally abusive and very financially controlling, even though they had lots of money and lived in a multi-million-dollar home in, you know, the San Fernando Valley. And he was you know, he earned a good income, controlled all of the finances, and, you know, and bullied her, really, you know, was terrible to her and terrible to their children. But he was also, you know, the dad that was coaching the soccer team, and he was the dad that was taking the kids to all these experiences. So she was...
Don't they always, I just want to interrupt, doesn't it always so often work out like that? They're super dad on the outside and on the inside. Super parent, should I say.
Right, super parent, exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, by the time she came to see me, most of her family knew what was going on. Like, he didn't necessarily, you know, her husband didn't hide it from their inner circle. He was still Mr. Wonderful on the outside. Her family was really frustrated with her. Her friends were starting to become frustrated, and she felt stuck. She had not pursued a career for many years. Her children loved their father. Her entire life was kind of centered around him and their community. And so she didn't really see an opportunity for herself to leave. And so I worked with her probably 8 months to a year, just on the education piece, just on helping her see what was happening, increasing her support, you know. And she eventually said, you know, I'm not going to leave. Like, I just can't uproot my children right now. And I just need to figure out a way to cope with this because he's going to obliterate me. On top of it, he's an attorney, right? So you can imagine how daunting it would be to try to divorce an attorney. So she withdrew from services, and that was it. And she came back. Now her children one child had graduated high school. The other one was, I don't know, sophomore, senior in high school. Now they're older. Now she really sees the toll that the verbal and emotional abuse has taken on her kids, right? Her children have anxiety, are having difficulty with, you know, with interpersonal relationships, difficulty with school, and she is in the same place, more isolated, probably more defeated. And she came back and said, I need to go. This is, you know, I see this, I should have left earlier. I see the toll this is taking on my children, but I can't live like this anymore. And so then we spent the next, you know, several months strategizing, planning. You know, in a lot of ways, having older children made the divorce easier because they weren't fighting custody. But ultimately she was able to leave, and she was able to create the type of life she had fantasized, 8 years prior when I worked with her about, working in a field that she was passionate about, leaving Los Angeles. She did not want to stay in Los Angeles, being able to move to a different state and have, a little home and a garden, all the things that she was denied in her marriage, and she did it. And that's a success for me. And I was fortunate enough to see that whole process with her. And I don't often get to do that. Like I said, I don't always get to know what happens to a client once they leave our agency, or if they decide to stay. And it was such a good example of somebody who wasn't ready then. And who am I to say, like, you need to go? And part of our education piece was telling her about the potential risks to her children, right? Like what would be the long-term implications of her children growing up in a home where there was this constant verbal, psychological abuse. And she saw that, but she also was able to do a lot of repair work with her children once she left. It's very hard, right? You can't heal from trauma when you're still living in trauma. You can't do repair work with your children when you're still being abused. So
that brings me to my next question. Like, how is it that, how do you advise people once they, they do have children and they are going to be, whether they're living with the person or they're sharing custody with the person, how do you work with a client like that in helping them protect their children?
Yeah. I'm very, very honest about I'm honest about a lot of things. I'm very honest about the impact of trauma on children and abuse, but I'm also really honest about what post-separation abuse looks like and how that affects the child and how that affects, the victim. And that when you have young children with an abuser, you never fully escape. You have this thing that these little things that connect you, right? These people that connect you to your partner. And so it's really hard. But the analogy that I use, right or wrong, is I say, like, if somebody came to me and told me that my children are being exposed to a toxic substance in my home 100% of the time, like every time my child is home, they're being exposed to something in the air, I would probably do everything I could to rectify that, to make sure that my children were inhaling clean, pure air as much as possible, right? Being in an abusive relationship and living in an abusive household is inhaling toxic fumes. Then if somebody said, listen, you're not going to be able to eliminate this toxic fumes 100%, but maybe 50%. So let's say best case scenario, 50-50 custody, 50% of the time your child will be in a toxic environment with that abusive parent, and 50% of the time you will have the opportunity to give them a cleaner air. So again, I would probably choose 50% clean air over 100% toxicity. And so I will share a version of that example with clients and say, it's going to be hard. Leaving an abuse, divorcing, separating from an abusive parent is torture. And it doesn't necessarily end when you have finalized divorce papers or when you have a finalized custody arrangement. It continues. But you have the opportunity, if you can carve this out, to give yourself, your children and yourself, some sense of normalcy half the time. And that's meaningful, right? It's not what we want as parents. We don't want our kids being in a toxic environment 100% of the time. It's not how we go into parenting. But sometimes that's the best that we can do. So I'm realistic, and I say it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be easy. A lot falls on the safe parent. They have to do so much more in terms of parenting and support and emotional support and caretaking than the abusive parent, and it's exhausting and it's not fair. But if you are wanting to leave an abusive relationship and you have children, It's possible. It's gonna be messy.
I firstly absolutely love that analogy. It just makes it so clear the way it's described, because it is toxic air. It is just this, you are infused with toxicity. So if you're able to step away from that for some of the time, it was like a light bulb moment for me. That I
Good.
love
And
that
even
analogy.
and even you know, one of the ways that people think about relationships and children is the belief that, like, well, if I stay in this relationship, I'm protecting my child from the abuse as much as you can. But that's, again, if we're using this air analogy, like, are you going to put your hand over your child's mouth and nose and prevent them from inhaling? No, like, you're really not. Like, you're just walking around fanning the air around them, but like, you're protecting them. I don't want to minimize that. There is actual protection happening, or, intervention, but it's not.
You're not protecting yourself either.
You're not protecting yourself either. And children need a safe parent. They need a parent that they can, they need a stable parent. And being in an abusive home is destabilizing to everybody in that home, including pets. So
that's so interesting.
Yeah.
So how do you educate yourself with all the things that are going on?
Well, you should see the books on my nightstand. I read a ton. I listen to podcasts. I do trainings when possible. I'm always trying to learn more about new trends in abuse. What are some of the new treatment modalities? How people are thinking about trauma these days. So I spend a lot of time reading when I have the time. That's through books and trainings. Yeah.
I mean, your organization does a lot of the trainings for the other organizations. So who trains you guys? I mean, so
we train ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, it is part of, right? When you are a clinician, like a physician, you are responsible for maintaining your own continuing education. So you're right. We do a lot of trainings in the community. To work in the field of domestic violence, you have to have a specific 40-hour training. And we put that on for community members and other, professionals. But I do a lot of my own research. And there's, right now, trauma, gaslighting are the key phrases, terms that are being used all over the place. And there are so many great people publishing work on this topic. So I just try to stay on top of it.
So what is your go-to podcast that you find is an absolute awesome resource?
It's a good one. I'm trying to think. Sometimes my podcasts are not related at all to DV, because I'm trying to come up with other interest. I'm trying to think what I really love. This is not necessarily a trauma podcast, but it is the New York Times The Daily, which is a 30-minute snippet of news that's happening, across the world. And I love it because it's not necessarily specific to DV. But one of the things that's, that is kind of unknown or not really commonly thought about when it comes to domestic violence is the intersection between domestic violence and other social issues that we have happening in our society. Homelessness. A large population of people who are homeless due to DV. Our criminal justice system and incarceration. Like 2/3 of women who are incarcerated, I believe in the state of New York, are incarcerated because they killed somebody who perpetrated violence against them. So when we talk about how do we change our criminal justice system and how do we have reform and stop mass incarcerating, we have to address family violence, right? Like, there's this show that my husband and I were watching about serial killers. It's like in a the documentary. Don't recommend watching this stuff before bed, but sometimes that's the only time we have. And every single one of these people who are in jail for murder grew up in homes where there was abuse. Community violence, but also family violence, and then they grew up in relationship violence. So we can't separate domestic violence from other issues that are happening in our world. Mass shootings, all of that.
I remember hearing this, and I found it so fascinating, is that not all people who have been abused, but all abusers were abused.
Yes.
Which is so fascinating to me to think about it, is that the line is that if you experienced abuse, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an abuser, but if you are abusing, you have experienced abuse somewhere along the way.
Yes. Right.
So by dealing with this issue, there's so many, it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. Right. So when I listen to a lot of these like news podcasts that, again, is not specifically about domestic violence, it all relates back because they're talking about issues, policing and other issues that happen in our society on a day-to-day basis. And I can find a way to connect it to my work.
I find that so fascinating. It makes sense though.
Yeah.
It absolutely does. You're in the thick of it. You're dealing with this all the time. How do you switch off from this? Because even for people who have experienced this it will be such a great example for them. It's like, how can they switch off?
Yeah. The switching off is probably, it's something I'm always working on. I don't think I have it perfected. Prior to telehealth, where, a lot of our services are being done, I would have like a 30-minute commute back and forth between the office and my home. And I would really use that 30 minutes to like shed my day. I would listen to music. I would drive with the windows open. I would specifically avoid being on a phone call or doing other things during that car ride. It was like really my process to shed my day. Once we started, when we all went remote and started working from home, that became harder because I lost my 30-minute commute, and it's, I go from my home office, then to my kitchen or to homework with my children. And then I don't have that same opportunity to kind of switch gears and shift roles. So I have to be more intentional about it. It's not built into my commute. So sometimes I just sit in my office. I try to move my body as much as I can. I'm very physically active. I have a wonderful group of friends and support system, and I do things with them. I have a, supportive family that understands that sometimes I need, 10 minutes to myself or maybe, or need a break. So it's something that I'm always actively working on, because it's not, even though I've been doing this for a long time, it's not necessarily, it doesn't come naturally. I have to be intentional about it. And sometimes I can become kind of relaxed in that, like, oh, it's okay, like I don't need downtime, but I do. And I'm sure if you ask the people who live with me, they'd say, yeah, you do.
So you also mentioned a little while ago, that there are these hot topics today, trauma, gaslighting. Do you think that that's serving the purpose, or is it becoming such a thrown around term that, like, oh, someone did something that is completely inconsequential and it's like, oh, they're gaslighting me or they caused me trauma. So how do you feel that that's...
Yeah, I have mixed feelings, because I think it's great that we're talking about this more. But I'm not sure we're always appropriately labeling things. And, the more we, again, soften some of this language, it may be then used against us. Like, I think that sometimes the term gaslighting is used to describe situations that may not apply. And then somebody who really feels like who is being gaslit or experiencing gaslighting feels like, I'm just using, like, nobody's going to believe me. This is just like the word of the year right now. Or we've really kind of hooked into trauma and everything's traumatic and I'm so traumatized. And that can be very minimizing to people who really experience trauma. Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate, who has this newish book, The Myth of Normal, he has a really good line in his book about kind of differentiating big T trauma and small t trauma, and that not every stressful, overwhelming event is a traumatic event, and that we really need to make those distinctions. There's a lot of trauma that happens, but sometimes the overuse or the overextension of these terms actually dilutes them.
That's
what you feel?
That's how I feel. Mm-hmm. I feel like with a lot of the terms that are throwing around at the moment, but I have seen it over the last few years since I've really been involved in this world, is the narcissist. It's like, yes, everybody is a narcissist these days.
Narcissist, right?
So I know when I end up having to describe something, I go,
no, it's like, he's a real narcissist.
Yeah, I go, it's narcissistic personality disorder. You feel like you have to preface it by saying, no, somebody who takes a couple extra selfies might have narcissistic tendencies or might, be self-involved, but they're not a narcissist.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I get that. So that's what I mean, is as somebody who really is on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse, somebody who really does have a lot of trauma and who's experienced gaslighting, sometimes they may feel that they have to really justify that because, again, these terms are overused and over applied.
So when you first started getting into this work, did you have a moment where, or a period of time where you're analyzing every relationship in your life?
100%. I used to play this game in my head where I would go to a public space. I'd be on an airplane, and I would know the statistics. One in 3 women and 1 in 3 men are abused, and I would look at people kind of as they're boarding, and I'd be like, are you an abuser? Are you a victim? I would play these games and just try to see who's who, or do the math and be like, okay, there's 200 people here. There's bound to be a certain percentage of perpetrators and a certain percentage of victims. Yes. And when I first started in this work, I have a sister who's younger than me, and I was married at the time, but I was already married, I should say, when I started working in this field, but my sister was dating, and she would call me and she'd be like, I went on this date with this guy, and I'd be like, sounds like an abuser. Yeah, he didn't open the door for you. He didn't offer to pay. He didn't ask you about your career. Done. There was a massive overcorrection that I had experienced. I was like, don't trust anybody. Find out about their childhood before you agree to a date. But I've since then come kind of more down the middle.
So it seems you've come more down the middle, but in the early stages, were you even apprehensive to let people close to you, friends and things like that, because you were like, oh, completely red flag, no, I'm not going there?
No, I don't know. I didn't have that experience. I've been really fortunate in my life that I have good people around me. What I did start seeing was, I saw other relationships, my own personal relationships, but also the relationships that of my friends, from a different lens, in a more complex way. For example, I grew up when I was growing up, I had a really close friend. I spent a ton of time in her home, and her parents were always fighting, yelling. It was a loud house. And I remember feeling scared of her father. And I remember my friend telling me that she was scared of her father. And there were just lots of things that I kind of started coming back to me about, experiences and memories I had in this home. And I thought to myself, and I remember having this like, oh my God, I bet you this was an abusive household. Like there's so many, things that came back to me about what my friend said, how her mother behaved, how I felt. And I was like, I had no words to describe what that was. I didn't know why I felt uncomfortable there. I didn't know why the dad was scary to me. But as an adult, I started reflecting back on some of these relationships or situations, seeing things from a different lens.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, even for my own personal journey, it's like once I had the education side of it, I was like, these other aspects of my life started to make sense. So I can only imagine for you, the education that you have is vast, like it's incredible.
Well, and the other thing that was really eye-opening to me about first starting in this field was that I had so many ideas of what domestic violence was, and they were all based on like things I would see on TV, like, Cops or some drama show. And it wasn't at all what I was seeing in my clients. I remember this, my very first client that I saw on my own was a woman who was in her 60s. She was the same age as my mother was at the time. She, again, was, first of all, gorgeous, educated, lived, had money, had adult children, was so put together. And she came to me because her husband had thrown her across the room the weekend before. And it was such like a dissonance between what I imagined your typical victim to look like, and who was sitting across from me. And all of a sudden I had this, this moment, I was like, I had no idea. Like I really had all these stereotypes and ideas, and this first client completely turned that upside down. And from then on, I have, it really changed how I see people, how I see relationships. A lot of the misconceptions that people, have about domestic violence, or, what your typical victim and what your typical perpetrator looks like. Again, perpetrators are these like, scary guys that wear these like, wife beater tank tops and, or alcoholics and scruffy. Like, no, they're men in suits, or they're women who are professionals. Like,
so, do you feel like you can see somebody's behavior now? So if you're let's say you're at a friend's dinner, and you could spot people who you think have tendencies to be abusers?
I mean, I don't know that I do, because I think abusers are really good at covering that stuff up out, in public and in social situations. I have seen people act ways that I think maybe are a little strange, or I've seen, some of my friends who turns out are also in unhealthy relationships feel, kind of protective of their partners, or become defensive, or don't do things to not, rock the boat. I've seen that, but I don't go into social situations and think like, oh, for sure that person's abusing or this person's a victim, because it's not so obvious. It's much more kind of nuanced and covert.
So I want to go back. You said that your first client was a woman who was in her 60s with grown children.
Yeah.
And was that the first sign of abuse in her relationship?
No. And in fact, it wasn't the first physical abusive incident. It was just finally the thing that made her call for help. But no, it was not her first first time being physically assaulted, and it wasn't the first time there was verbal abuse. But finally, she decided that she needed to get additional help. And I think it was actually even at the urging of her children, who were really concerned for her safety, because she also had other medical issues. And so being physically abused was just exacerbating other medical problems that she was having.
So do you feel like there's a pattern, like somebody's in a relationship for a certain period of time and then the abuse starts to show itself and then start to escalate?
Yes.
And is there a time frame generally or no?
No, there's no specific time frame. There can be a predictable kind of pattern of events. So first of all, there's, the cycle of violence, right? This tension building phase, then there's an explosion, and then there's a honeymoon phase. So in the beginning of a relationship, like, you may have very few incidents of tension or explosion, and you may spend a lot of time in that honeymoon phase. And then over time, there's more tension, there's more conflict, there's more big blow-ups, there's fewer opportunities or time for repair, or, less honeymoon. But typically, the typical, victim or survivor will say, in the beginning things were good, but things started, like, my partner would be really jealous, or my partner would be really possessive, or they wanted to move very quickly in our relationship, like a lot of pressure to be physically intimate, to be emotionally intimate, to be exclusive. That's a pretty consistent, predictable pattern that I see. And then, like I said, the jealousy, the possessiveness, the wanting to know where you are, can be flattering in the beginning. It may feel really good to be love bombed in those ways, especially if maybe you have your own trauma history and you don't have, there's some attachment stuff. It feels good when somebody wants to be with you. And then there's the fighting and feeling like my partner picks fights with me and I'm not exactly sure why. And I always feel like I'm misunderstood, or things that I say get blown out of context, or my partner's mood is unpredictable. So there's some of that, right, that just kind of happens over time. And sometimes those incidents last, years. But there is an escalation pattern, right? Over time, the abuse will get worse. It may not become physical, but it will become worse. The verbal will become constant. The psychological, emotional will be all the time.
And why do you think that is?
Because, it's like a cancer. It just keeps kind of growing and growing. And the abusive partner wants to have ultimate control over their other partner, and they will use all tactics to kind of keep that going. The other thing is, right, like, I don't work with perpetrators of abuse, so I say this knowing that most of my experience comes from reading and from the clients, but perpetrators have their own trauma history, and the reason it keeps getting worse is because they're not treating the core issue. Like, they believe the core issue is the other person. And even when the other person does all the modifications, I call it shrinking, right? I say that, someone who's in an abusive relationship becomes so small. They shrink themselves to take up less space, to make less sound, to be invisible. And yet the abuser keeps abusing because it's not about the victim. They make it seem like it's about you. They make you believe it's about you, but it's not about you, because your partner says, if you just had sex with me more, I wouldn't be so crabby. Great, let's have sex every single day. Guess what? He's still crabby.
It's like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Whatever you do is not right.
Whatever you do is not right, because the not right doesn't live in you. The not right lives in the perpetrator, but they don't have the capacity to see that. So instead, they just continue to abuse the person.
So do you think it's a lack of capacity and self-awareness? Do you think it's intentional?
I think it's both. I think it's a lack of, and I think it can be both, right? Those are not mutually exclusive. I think it can be a lack of self-awareness and capacity. And I also think that they know that like this kind of stuff, I can't do with everybody, right? Like the abusers who are functional adults out in the world and who run companies and, you know, see patients and whatever, and don't abuse everybody that they come into contact with, they understand, like, I can't do that to everybody, but I feel entitled to do that to my partner because my partner is my possession or my property or, you know, an extension of me. And my partner is the source of my unhappiness, so I can do that.
It makes so much sense. I love the way you're describing all of these things. It's our final question, because
Sure.
Freddie, I mean, I could talk to you for hours about this. It's so incredibly fascinating, and you are so
anytime.
so knowledgeable.
Yeah.
What would be your best recommendation for somebody to take a step right now after listening to this?
Right now, I would consider looking up local resources, calling a domestic violence crisis line, looking up books on the topic. There are a lot, and there's, you know, you can probably do a good search on books on domestic violence. I'm a huge fan of anything written by Lundy Bancroft. I think he does a really good job. Why does he do that? I think he does a really good job of explaining what's happening in an abusive dynamic. And I would start there, like start educating yourself, finding out what resources are available to you in your community, and go from there. And then maybe consider calling an agency or calling a therapist or buying one of those books. Like, you don't have to do everything at once. First, do the research, find the names, and then next step, maybe making a call.
Well, Vivian, it's been so wonderful, and I feel so privileged to have had this time with you today. Where can people find you?
That's a good question. Well, you can find me at Jewish Family Service Hope, and you can go to jfsla.org, and you'll find all of our services, and you can find the domestic violence program there. And then for my private practice, you'll just find me online, Vivian Engel, Marriage and Family Therapist, ENGLE.
Well, thank you so much for being with us here on Trauma Undone and listening. Stay tuned for next time, and let healing begin.